On February 23, 1906, at exactly 1:17 p.m., a middle-aged man stood on the gallows of Cook County Jail in Chicago. The crowd that gathered outside could hear nothing but the February wind cutting through the prison walls. Inside, Johann Otto Hoch, though that wasn't his real name, adjusted the noose around his neck with an almost casual acceptance. "O Lord our Father, forgive them all," he said, his German accent still thick after 2 decades in America. "They know not what they do. They hang an innocent man." The trapdoor opened. Within seconds it was over. What the crowd didn't know was that they had just witnessed the execution of what Chicago police called America's greatest mass murderer. A man who had married at least 55 women across the country, stealing their life savings before poisoning many of them with arsenic. A man whose real body count remains a mystery to this day, somewhere between 15 confirmed victims and possibly 50 dead women. But Johann Otto Hoch was never just one man. He was John Schmidt, Jacob Hoch, Henry Bartel, Dr. James, Count Otto van Kern, and dozens of other identities. Each name represented a new hunting ground, a fresh start, and inevitably another victim. This is the story of the Chicago Bluebeard, a man who turned marriage into murder and love into a death sentence. Before we dive into this incredible case, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Today's story is one of the most shocking serial killer cases from early 20th century America, and you won't want to miss any of the unbelievable details. Our story begins in 1855, in the small German village of Horweiler, located in what was then the Grand Duchy of Hesse. It was here that John Schmidt was born into a world that seemed ordinary enough. His father worked as a laborer, his mother tended to the household, and young John appeared to be just another child in a rural German community. But something was different about John Schmidt from the very beginning. While other children played together, John preferred to observe. He watched how people interacted, how they trusted, how they made decisions. He was learning the art of manipulation before he even knew what the word meant. Growing up in post-unification Germany wasn't easy. The country was rapidly industrializing, and traditional rural life was disappearing. For many young Germans, America represented hope, a place where anyone could reinvent themselves and find prosperity. For John Schmidt, America would become something else entirely, a hunting ground. In his early 20s, John made a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless women across America. He married a local woman named Christine Ramb. For a brief moment, it seemed like John might settle into a normal life. Christine bore him 3 children, and they lived quietly in their German village. But normality wasn't enough for John Schmidt. In 1887, when his youngest child was barely walking, John simply disappeared. He left Christine with 3 children to raise alone, no money, and no explanation. It was the first time John Schmidt would abandon a wife, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. What Christine didn't know was that her husband hadn't just left, he had died, at least on paper. John Schmidt ceased to exist the moment he decided to start over. From that point forward, he would become whoever he needed to be to get what he wanted. By the 1890s, the man who had once been John Schmidt stepped off a ship in New York Harbor. America was booming. Cities were growing at an incredible pace, and opportunities seemed endless for those willing to work for them. But our man wasn't interested in honest work. He had spent his years since leaving Germany perfecting a very specific skill set. He could read people, understand their weaknesses, their desires, their fears. More importantly, he had learned that loneliness was the most profitable emotion in America. The country was full of widows. The Civil War had claimed hundreds of thousands of men. Industrial accidents took thousands more every year. Immigration patterns meant that many women found themselves alone in foreign cities, far from family support. These women had something John wanted: money, property, and most importantly, trust that could be exploited. John's first target in America appears to have been a woman named Annie Hoch, though records from this early period are unclear. What we do know is that Annie was an invalid, possibly suffering from some chronic illness that made her dependent on others. She died within a few years of their marriage, and John took her last name. He was no longer John Schmidt. He was now John Hoch, the first of many identities he would steal from his victims. The pattern was set. John would place advertisements in newspapers, specifically targeting matrimonial sections where widows and single women looked for companionship. His ads were carefully crafted to appeal to vulnerable women. Respectable German gentleman seeks companionship with refined lady for matrimony, financial security assured. What made Johann Hoch so effective wasn't just his ability to lie. It was his ability to become exactly what each woman needed him to be. If a woman was lonely, he was the perfect companion. If she was worried about financial security, he presented himself as a successful businessman. If she craved adventure, he was worldly and exciting. His method was methodical and deadly. John would place matrimonial advertisements in newspapers, carefully crafting them to attract vulnerable women. Respectable German gentleman seeks companionship with refined lady for matrimony. Financial security assured. He targeted widows specifically, women who had experienced love and loss, who understood the value of companionship and security. Once he identified a target, John would court her with impressive attention to detail. He arrived well-dressed, spoke with an educated accent, and most importantly, he listened. He learned about her fears, her dreams, her financial situation, and her family relationships. Then he used all of that information against her. Arsenic became his weapon of choice. It was easily available at hardware stores and pharmacies, marketed for everything from rat poison to medical treatments. When given in small doses over time, arsenic poisoned slowly, creating symptoms that doctors often mistook for natural illness: stomach problems, fatigue, hair loss, and progressive weakness. The beauty of John's system, from his twisted perspective, was its efficiency. While his victims grew weaker, he gained complete control over their finances. He would convince them to liquidate their assets, transfer property titles, and give him access to their bank accounts. By the time they died, he had already stolen everything of value. Between 1890 and 1905, Johann Hoch became dozens of different men. He was H. Frick in Chicago, Dr. James in Milwaukee, Count Otto van Kern when he needed European nobility, Jacob Erdorf when he wanted to seem like a successful businessman. Each identity came with forged documents, rehearsed backstories, and carefully constructed personalities. The transformation wasn't just about names, it was about becoming completely different people. As Dr. James, he could discuss medical treatments with authority. As Count Otto van Kern, he spoke of European estates and noble connections. As a simple immigrant businessman, he talked about the value of hard work and traditional family values. His victim profile was consistent: middle-aged widows with modest savings and property. Take Maria Steinbucher, a widow living in Chicago in 1895. When John, calling himself Jacob Hoch, answered her matrimonial advertisement, she thought her prayers had been answered. For 4 months she believed she had found love again. She had no way of knowing that her new husband was slowly poisoning her with arsenic, waiting patiently for her to die so he could claim the $4,000 from her property. Maria knew something was wrong. On her deathbed, she told several people that her husband was killing her, but in 1895, the idea seemed so outrageous that no one took her seriously. She died in agony, and John disappeared with her money. Not all of his victims died by poison. Some, like Mary Rankin, were simply abandoned after being robbed. John married her in November 1895 and vanished with her savings the next day, leaving her alive but financially destroyed. Barbara Brossette of San Francisco wasn't so lucky. After John disappeared with $1,165 of her money in 1896, the shock and financial devastation killed her anyway. Even when he didn't directly murder someone, his actions could still prove fatal. What's remarkable about Johann Hoch's killing spree is how many times he almost got caught, only to slip away at the last moment. In 1895, he was arrested in Chicago under the alias C.A. Calford and charged by a woman named Janet Spencer with elopement, marriage, and desertion. While in custody, he was identified as being involved in other crimes, including the abduction of a woman named Huldah Stevens and participation in a diamond robbery. But John was nothing if not resourceful. He managed to get himself released, immediately changed his identity again and continued his murderous activities in a different city. In 1898, operating under the name Martin Dose, John was arrested in Chicago for selling already mortgaged furniture, essentially stealing from creditors. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail, which should have ended his career permanently. Instead, he used his time in prison to plan his next moves and develop new identities. When he was released in 1899, John had learned from his mistakes. By 1904, John had been operating his deadly scheme for over a decade. He had killed dozens of women, stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and crossed the country multiple times, always staying one step ahead of the law. He had become overconfident, and overconfidence would prove to be his downfall. In October 1904, using the name John Schmidt, ironically his real name, John married Caroline Stryker in Philadelphia. Caroline was different from his usual victims. She was younger, more suspicious, and had family members who paid attention to what was happening in her life. John followed his usual pattern. He married Caroline, began the process of gaining control over her finances, and then disappeared 11 days later. But this time Caroline's family wasn't willing to let it go. They contacted the police, filed charges, and began an investigation. Meanwhile, John had moved on to Chicago, where he set up his most elaborate scheme yet. He leased a cottage, furnished it carefully, and began courting two sisters, Marie Valker and Emily Fisher. Marie Valker owned a candy store, which she sold for $75 to give John money to invest in a furniture business. She also turned over her life savings of $350. In December 1904, they were married, and Marie moved into the cottage John had prepared. What Marie didn't know was that John had already been slowly poisoning her. By December 20th, just 10 days after their wedding, Marie was violently ill. The symptoms matched arsenic poisoning perfectly: severe stomach pain, vomiting, hair loss, and progressive weakness. On January 12, 1905, Marie Walker died in agony. Most serial killers would have disappeared after such a close call, but John had become addicted to the thrill of the hunt. More importantly, he had identified another potential victim who was even more valuable than Marie, her sister, Emily Fisher. 3 days after Marie's funeral, John asked Emily to marry him. His reasoning was both calculated and twisted. Who better to comfort him in his grief than his dead wife's sister? Emily, still mourning her sister, and perhaps suspicious about the circumstances of Marie's death, initially hesitated, but John was persistent and persuasive. He convinced Emily that Marie would have wanted them to find comfort in each other. On January 15, 1905, just 3 days after burying her sister, Emily Fisher married Johann Otto Hoch in Joliet, Illinois. Emily immediately handed over $750 to her new husband, money she had been saving for years. But unlike his previous victims, Emily's family members were watching closely. More importantly, she had at least one person in her life who wasn't fooled by John's act: her sister. When Emily's other sister learned about the quick marriage and the money that had changed hands, she became suspicious. She had never trusted John, and Marie's sudden death had raised questions in her mind. She confronted Emily directly, calling John a murderer and a swindler. For the first time in his career, John faced immediate direct opposition from someone who couldn't be charmed, threatened, or eliminated. Rather than risk exposure, he made a tactical retreat. He took Emily's money and disappeared, leaving Chicago for New York City. After fleeing Chicago with Emily Fisher's money, John made his way to New York City in late January 1905. He was now 50 years old and had been running his deadly scheme for 15 years. But instead of laying low, he immediately began hunting for another victim. Using the alias Harry Bartels, John rented a room from Catherine Kimmel, a middle-aged widow who took in boarders to support herself. Catherine owned a house in New York and seemed to have modest savings, exactly the type of woman John had targeted dozens of times before. John began his usual routine. He was charming, attentive, and interested in Catherine's life. He asked about her finances under the guise of offering investment advice. He spoke about his own supposed wealth and business connections. Within just a few days, he was ready to make his move. On January 30th, 1905, John proposed marriage to Catherine Kimmel. It was a proposal that should have followed his established pattern: quick acceptance, rapid access to her money, and then either abandonment or murder. But Catherine Kimmel said no. Something about Harry Bartels didn't sit right with her. Maybe it was his eagerness to move so quickly, or the way he seemed more interested in her financial situation than her personality. Maybe she had heard stories about men who preyed on lonely widows, or maybe she simply had good instincts about people. Her rejection was a disaster for John's carefully planned operation. For the first time in years, his charm had failed completely. Normally, this would have been his signal to disappear immediately, change his identity again, and find a new hunting ground. But John made a fatal error. Instead of leaving New York, he stayed in Catherine's boarding house. He may have been tired after decades of constant movement and identity changes. He may have become overconfident after so many successful schemes, or he may have simply been unable to accept that his methods had failed. Catherine Kimmel, meanwhile, had time to think about her strange boarder who had proposed marriage after knowing her for less than a week. She began asking questions around the neighborhood about Harry Bartels. She made inquiries with local authorities. On January 30th, 1905, she contacted the New York police with her suspicions about the man renting a room in her house. When New York police arrested Harry Bartels on January 30th, 1905, they had no idea they had captured one of America's most wanted men. The arrest was for a relatively minor complaint, a suspicious person who might have been running a confidence game. But John had been carrying identification documents for multiple identities, which immediately raised red flags. When questioned, he claimed his name was Johann Otto Hoch, but police found evidence connecting him to numerous other names and locations. As investigators began to dig deeper, the scope of John's crimes became clear. They found matrimonial advertisements he had placed in newspapers across the country. They discovered bank records showing suspicious financial transactions. Most importantly, they began receiving reports from police departments in other cities about similar cases involving men who matched John's description. The investigation quickly focused on Chicago, where Marie Walker's recent death and John's hasty marriage to her sister had already attracted attention. Chicago Police Detective George Shippey took charge of the case and began what would become one of the most extensive investigations in the city's history. Detective Shippey and his team faced an enormous challenge. John had been operating for over 15 years, using dozens of identities in cities across the country. Many of his potential victims were dead, and others were too embarrassed to come forward. Documentation was scarce, and communication between police departments was slow and unreliable. But Shippey was persistent and methodical. He began by focusing on the cases they could prove: Marie Walker's death and John's marriage to Emily Fisher. From there, he worked backward, tracing John's movements through Chicago and connecting him to other suspicious deaths and disappearances. As news of John's arrest spread through newspapers across the country, something remarkable happened. Women who had survived encounters with him began coming forward. Police departments from multiple states began sharing information about similar cases. A picture began to emerge of a criminal operation, unlike anything law enforcement had ever seen. The evidence against John was overwhelming, but it was also frustratingly incomplete. Many of his victims were dead and buried, their bodies long since decomposed beyond the possibility of detecting poison. Financial records were scattered or destroyed. Witnesses were hard to find or unwilling to testify. Detective Shippey made a strategic decision. Rather than trying to prosecute John for all of his suspected crimes, they would focus on building an ironclad case for the murder of Marie Walker. Marie's death was recent, the evidence was fresh, and they had multiple witnesses who could testify about John's behavior before and after her death. The investigation revealed that John had purchased large quantities of arsenic in the weeks leading up to Marie's death. They found witnesses who testified that Marie had complained of being poisoned. Most damning of all, they were able to trace John's financial activities and show that he had systematically stolen Marie's money while she was dying. On February 1st, 1905, 2 indictments were returned against John for bigamy. By February 5th, 5 more alleged wives had identified him. The number of potential victims continued to grow as the investigation expanded. The trial of Johann Otto Hoch for the murder of Marie Walker began in May 1905, and it quickly became a media sensation. Newspapers across the country covered every detail of the proceedings. The public was fascinated by the story of a man who had turned marriage into murder. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney John J. Healy, presented a methodical case. They showed how John had systematically poisoned Marie while stealing her money. They presented evidence of his multiple identities and previous crimes. They brought in witnesses who testified about John's behavior and Marie's final days. The defense faced an almost impossible task. John's attorney, William Vahey, attempted to argue that Marie had died of natural causes and that the evidence against his client was circumstantial. But the evidence was simply too strong. Perhaps most damaging to John's case was his own behavior during the trial. Rather than showing remorse or even concern, he appeared almost bored by the proceedings. He seemed to view the trial as an inconvenience rather than a fight for his life. On May 19, 1905, after deliberating for just a few hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Johann Otto Hoch was sentenced to death by hanging. Even as he faced execution, John maintained his innocence. In interviews with reporters, he claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. He insisted that he had genuinely loved his wives and that their deaths were coincidental. "I am an innocent man," he told one reporter. "They are hanging me because they need someone to blame for these deaths." But privately, John may have revealed a different attitude. According to some reports, he once told a fellow prisoner, "Women are all right in their place, but marry only one at a time." John's execution was originally scheduled for August 25, 1905, but his attorney filed appeals that delayed the process for several months. Remarkably, even as he sat on death row, John continued to receive support from some of the women in his life. Cora Wilson, a Chicago woman who had apparently become fascinated with John's case, advanced money so he could appeal his sentence to the Illinois Supreme Court. Even more surprisingly, Emily Fisher, the sister of his victim and his final wife, attempted to save him from execution. The appeals process revealed just how extensive John's criminal career had been. Investigators continued to uncover evidence of additional victims and crimes. By the time his appeals were exhausted, authorities suspected him of being connected to as many as 50 deaths, but the Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction and death sentence. On December 16, 1905, they refused to intervene further. Johann Otto Hoch's execution was scheduled for February 23, 1906. On the morning of February 23, 1906, Johann Otto Hoch woke up in his cell at Cook County Jail for the last time. He had spent nearly a year on death row, maintaining his innocence and filing appeals. Now at age 51, his time had run out. According to witnesses, John remained calm and collected as his execution time approached. He ate breakfast, spoke with a minister, and wrote several letters. Even facing death, he continued to claim that he was innocent of Marie Walker's murder. At 1:17 p.m., John was led to the gallows. A crowd had gathered outside the jail, but the execution itself was conducted privately, with only authorized witnesses present. As the noose was placed around his neck, John was given the opportunity to make a final statement. His last words were a mixture of defiance and religious appeal. "O Lord our Father, forgive them all. They know not what they do. They hang an innocent man. I am innocent. Goodbye." The trapdoor opened, and Johann Otto Hoch died almost instantly of a broken neck. The body was lowered and handed over to undertaker Ernst Matz. After nearly 2 decades of murder and deception, the Chicago Bluebeard was finally stopped. The execution of Johann Otto Hoch marked the end of one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history, but questions about his crimes persist to this day. How many women did he actually kill? How much money did he steal? How many other victims remain undiscovered? What we know for certain is that John Hoch married at least 55 women between 1890 and 1905. Police were certain of 15 murder victims, but contemporary reports suggested the actual number could be as high as 50. The financial damage was enormous. John stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, leaving countless families devastated. As we remember this case, we honor not just the victims whose names we know, but also the countless others whose stories remain untold. Marie Walker, Maria Steinbucher, Caroline Streicher, Clara Bartel, and all the rest. They were more than just victims of a serial killer. They were women who deserved better than the fate that found them. What do you think about the case of Johann Otto Hoch? Could something like this happen today, or have we learned enough from cases like his to prevent similar tragedies? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as I did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true crime content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and check out our other videos about history's most notorious criminals. Until next time, stay safe and remember, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem the most trustworthy.